All right. So today we're talking about feudal Japan. So this is a new section. So go ahead and kind of skip a couple lines on your notes. And we're going to write down feudal Japan. Or if you're writing this paper, you can start up a new page. So we're going to write down feudal Japan and then underline our new section title. So when we're talking about feudal Japan is talking about the time period of Japan in which we have lords that own huge amounts of land. We have samurai, we have armor, right? So we got swords and armor as well. So that's a lot of what feudal Japan is kind of about, when there is still an emperor of Japan, but he doesn't really have power over all of Japan. Japan kind of breaks into several different territories and so forth that are controlled by these lords that own large amounts of land, and the emperors is kind of just around. Gotta make a bullet, and we're gonna write down adoption of Chinese culture. So bullet, adoption of Chinese culture. So Japan originally, when Japan starts up as a nation, their culture, the way how they build their houses, the way how they write their stories, for example, in literature, is very similar to that of China. They're very similar to them. So if you went to Japan or went to China in about the year 300 to year 710 Common Era, so after the year 0, you would see that the area will look relatively the same. There wouldn't be a lot of difference between Japan and China. You really want to know which country you were in if you're just dropped in one, because they look the same. Go ahead and make a 1. We're going to write down Kenji characters. So 1 Kenji characters. So the way in how Japan, how they write their words is called, they use these things called Kenji characters. And it's not so much that they're letters, how we have like 26 letters in the English alphabet. It's more or less that these are syllables. So every character is a syllable in their language. So every character is a syllable in their language. Go ahead and make a 2. And for 2, we're going to write down, let me find, there it is. 2, we're going to write down Chinese art and literature. So they had these Kenji characters that they were borrowing from the Chinese. The Chinese were using these Kenji characters as well. But 2 is going to be Chinese art and literature, so Chinese art and literature. So they also did borrow Chinese art and architecture as well. The architecture of China, as you guys have kind of seen before, you have those roofs with like the curved roofs, for example, and they kind of curved edges on the side of the roofs. That is architecture that, was kind of come up in China that the Japanese kind of borrowed. And eventually the Japanese are going to kind of make their own style with those curved roofs and such. Go ahead and make it 3. I'm going to write down government structure. So 3, government structure. So 3, government structure. So the government structure is just with having the emperor being in charge, and then having government officials kind of helping out, just in a very similar style to what the Chinese were also doing at the time period. Now, eventually, as I said, Japan starts to kind of shift away from what the Chinese were doing. But before they started shifting away, like the princes in Japan, Prince Shotoku, he started adopting a lot of Chinese culture and kind of coming to this idea of Confucianism. Confucianism is basically saying like, hey, a pencil writes, a soldier fights in wars, a prince runs a nation. That's kind of what Confucianism is. It's like, hey, what is your job? Like, what are you supposed to do? That's kind of what Confucianism is a bit about. And that's also when Buddhism starts coming over. It's kind of to Japan as well, and it's going to start kind of mixing in with Shintoism. But eventually, during the Heian period, that's when Japan starts to move away from what the Chinese were doing. Go ahead and make a new bullet and write down Heian period 794 to 1156 Common Era. So Heian period 794 to 1156 Common Era. So in the Heian period, they're starting to kind of move away from that time. So they're really kind of starting to move away from what's going on at that time period. And they're starting to move away from the Chinese and start kind of developing their own thing. They start to kind of grow these very large like land estates. What that kind of means, the large land estates, it's talking about how there were these lords that were owning huge amounts of territory, huge amounts of land. And they're kind of running their own little sections of Japan without the emperor having any input. So that was different than what was going on in China at this time period. So they really started kind of developing their own way of running things that was very different from the way that the Chinese were doing things. So we're going to make a one. We're going to write down moving away from Chinese and moving away from Chinese. So during this time period, that's when Japan, really starts kind of developing themselves, kind of really develops their own style of doing things. And eventually what ends up happening is that Buddhism is, as I said, kind of came in before. Buddhism, especially in the form of Zen, and Zen is kind of a lot more about meditation and such. A lot of the Buddhism meditation form really gets combined in with Shintoism. And the religion in Japan really starts to turn from being a purely Shinto religion to kind of this Shinto Buddhist religion, in which both of the ideas have kind of combined together, as I said, especially the Buddhism aspects and meditation. Gotta make it two. And we're gonna write down Buddhism in the form of Zen. So two, Buddhism in the form of Zen. So this is kind of just talking about some of the things that they did borrow from the Chinese, like the writing style, like we talked about before, artistic style, how you draw paintings. But they didn't borrow the Chinese civil service system. What's the civil service system the Chinese had? The civil service system that the Chinese had would be you would kind of take a test to be in government. You did well, you got to be part of be part of government. If you did poorly, you're not part of government. And anybody could take the test to be part of the government. The Japanese didn't borrow that system of putting people in the government positions that did well in a test. This is kind of a bit hard to read, but I'll read it to you. So during the Heian period, at royal gatherings, women were expected to be as cultured as men. Women wrote plays, they played flutes or stringed instruments in informal concerts, and they became embroiled in elaborate schemes to snub or disgrace rivals. Like their counterparts in China and the Islamic world, they also became involved in palace intrigues and power struggles. So that's just kind of going a little more into women and kind of their roles in society. So it's not like women are just sitting around doing nothing. They did start to become involved in backroom politics and getting into power struggles in terms of backroom politics and trying to gain advantages over other opponents and so forth, as the way things kind of go. Court dresses is just the way people would dress at the time period in court. In court would mean that you're in the presence of like the emperor. So like if you're in the same room as him, that's called the court, basically. Court can also be people that live kind of with the emperor. So if someone kind of lived with the emperor, they would be part of his court. So it's like, hey, this person lives in the emperor's palace. That person is part of the emperor's court. So that's kind of what that means. But that's kind of how you were dressed at the time period for males and for women. Okay. Next thing. So for the next thing, if you're doing this on paper, go ahead and kind of draw this and make this if you would. So if you're doing it on paper, go ahead and make this. If you're doing this on a computer, let's kind of arrange it where emperor is going to be on the very top, so that'd be like 1. And then 2, political leader equals shogun. 3, nobles equal damos. And they can put another equal sign, warrior class. And then it'd be warriors equal samurai, equal sign, warrior class. Paid soldiers equal sign, ronin, equal sign, warrior caste. Okay. So kind of arrange it like that. So you got emperor equal figurehead, political leader equal shogun, equal warrior caste. All right. And you kind of go along like that. All right. So if you're doing this on paper, just kind of make this. If you're doing this on a computer, I kind of label things as I was kind of saying there. And I'll talk about each one of these groups. So in terms of feudal society, the person who's at the very top of society was the emperor. So the emperor is at the very top. However, the emperor didn't really rule. They were, the figurehead, the political representation of the entire country, but they didn't really rule. You see, instead, the person ruled was a shogun. A shogun was someone who they basically had control of the country because they had the biggest army diplomacy. You have the biggest army, you're kind of in charge. So a shogun generally has a pretty big army, and they have several allies, and the shogun with their allies have the biggest amount of military forces in the country. So they run everything. Because if you go against the shogun, then you kind of get crushed because, well, he's got a huge army and plus tons of allies. What allies would a shogun have? So a shogun would be nice as someone who owns a whole bunch of land, has their own military force. The allies that we have would be what we call damos. And damos could be someone that was working with the shogun or not working with them. But damo was just a guy that was rich, that owned a ton of land as well, and also had their own personal army. So shogun just has the biggest army of all the damos. And a damo is just someone, again, who owns a lot of land and has their own personal military force. What do I mean by owning a lot of land? So let's say there was a damo that controlled all the way from Indianapolis to Columbus. Okay, so that's their territory. They have this vast territory that they control. And because they control that territory, they're the ones running it. So like a governor, except, more power, basically. So they kind of run that entire area. They collect taxes from the area. They have their own military force from the areas and so forth. And the damos would hire people to then protect the land and also be the elite warriors of their military forces. That's called samurai. So that's our samurai. They're the elite warriors for the damos. So they're similar to knights. In Europe they have knights, with armor and so forth. Samurai, same thing. Samurais are given like land in the damos area. Okay, so it'd be like, hey, samurai, I've hired you, and you're gonna own some land out here outside the city of Columbus. There's like 50 people that live on this land out here. It's like farmlands, like 50 people's farmlands. And your job is to, one, protect them, two, collect taxes from them, and then you get a split of the money, and then you can use that money to buy yourself, weapons and armor and so forth. Although samurai would generally live a very simple life. So, they kind of have weapons and armor and so forth that they bought for themselves, but they live in, usually a relatively simple life and didn't, have tons of stuff. Unlike knights in Europe, which would have been more greedier. And that samurai would then train up people, and the damo too would also train up people. But they would train up people, ronins. Those are like paid soldiers. Although generally a ronin is a samurai who doesn't have a master, but we'll just go with paid soldiers for now. We're going with the title there. So you would have these paid soldiers that would be part of the army that would be trained up by the samurai. So they'd be trained up to be part of the military forces for the damo. So you have these guys that would be trained up that would be part of the military forces for the damo. So they're paid soldiers. Below them, the next group was peasants. So your farmers and fishermen, which was 90% of the population. Now, normally peasants are on the very bottom of every single population pyramid where we're going to see. But this time period, peasants actually made more money than these two groups. However, in about 500 years after this point, in about the year 1600, these guys will get shifted all the way down to the bottom. So eventually peasants will be at the bottom because they're a huge population part. You can see how they're 90% of the population. But peasants are people that be farmers or fishers. Okay, that's what peasants are. Artisans are people that make stuff like blacksmiths. So blacksmiths are people that make stuff. So people that make swords, spears, rakes. All right, so people that actually make things with iron and so forth. That's the artisans. All right, so people that make stuff. And then merchants are people that went around and sold stuff between town and town. So it's someone moving a whole bunch of swords from one city to another city. All right, that's a merchant. And merchants were kind of looked down upon in Japan And that at this time period in year like 1000, eventually these merchants will make a ton of money and they're going to swap with the peasants. And then I said it would be at the year about 1600 or so. Okay, let's go ahead and stop there.